But more often, they're speaking God's message to the people, and typically his chosen people. That's usually where the emphasis lies. Before we get started with reading through the text, we're actually going to go ahead and watch a video on Jeremiah real quick. To kind of give us an overview of the book we're about ready to study.
The book of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah was an Israelite priest who lived and worked in Jerusalem during the final decades of the kingdom of southern Judah. He was called as a prophet to warn Israel about the severe consequences of breaking their covenant with God through their idolatry and injustice, and he even predicted that the empire of Babylon would come as God's servant to bring this judgment on Israel by destroying Jerusalem, taking the people into exile. And sadly, his words became reality. Jeremiah lived through the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and witnessed the exile personally. Now, this book came into existence in a really interesting way. Chapter 36 tells us that after 20 years of Jeremiah's preaching in Jerusalem, God called him to collect all of his sermons and poems and essays and commit them to writing, which Jeremiah did by employing a scribe named Baruch, who wrote down and compiled all of this material into a scroll. Now, Baruch also gathered lots of stories about Jeremiah, and he linked all the pieces together. And so this is why the book reads like an anthology, a collection of collections. It's all been arranged to present this prophet as a messenger of God's justice and grace. So the book begins with God calling Jeremiah to be a prophet, and he's given a dual vocation. He will be a prophet to Israel, but also to the nations. And his words will both uproot and tear down, but also plant and build up. In other words, he's going to accuse Israel and warn them of God's coming judgment, but he also has a message of hope for the future. Now, this opening perfectly summarizes the first large section, chapters 1 to 24. It's a collection of Jeremiah's writings from before the exile. And the core idea here is that Israel has broken the covenant with God and violated all the terms of the agreement they made that are written in the Torah, and in a number of ways. They've adopted the worship of all kinds of Canaanite gods, building idol shrines all over the land, and Jeremiah develops the metaphor of idolatry as adultery, and uses the language of prostitution, promiscuity, unfaithfulness to describe how Israel has given their allegiance to other gods. Jeremiah also repeatedly accuses Israel's leaders. The priests, the kings, the other prophets have all become corrupt. They've abandoned the Torah and the covenant, which has led to a tragic result: rampant social injustice. The most vulnerable people in Israelite communities, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, were all being taken advantage of in clear violation of the laws of the Torah, and Israel's leaders didn't even seem to care. So a classic place where all of these ideas come together is in chapter 7. It's called Jeremiah's Temple Sermon. The Israelites are coming to worship their God in the temple as if everything is just fine, but outside the temple they are worshiping other gods, and some were even adopting the horrifying Canaanite practice of child sacrifice. And so Jeremiah makes his very unpopular announcement. The God of Israel is coming in judgment. He's going to destroy his own temple and punish Israel by sending an enemy from the north. This is an army that God would allow to conquer Jerusalem, and as you read on, you discover he's talking about the great empire of Babylon. And so this all leads up to a transition in chapter 25. Israel hasn't turned back to their God, and so in the first year of Babylon's new king, Nebuchadnezzar, God tells Jeremiah to announce that the Babylonian armies are headed for Israel and all of its neighbors to conquer them and take them into exile for 70 years. He compares Babylon to a cup of wine filled to the brim with God's just anger at all of Israel's injustice and idolatry, and God will make Israel and the nations drink from this cup. Now, this chapter is key to the book's design because everything that follows is going to focus on Babylon's coming attack. First on Israel in chapters 26 to 45, and then on the other nations in chapters 46 to 51. The section about Israel first contains stories about how Jeremiah begged Israel to turn back, how he warned them right up to the last minute, but the leaders of Israel kept rejecting him. This section concludes with a large collection of stories about how Jerusalem was under siege and eventually destroyed by Babylon, and about how Jeremiah was persecuted all through that time and eventually kidnapped and taken against his will to Egypt by a group of Israelite rebels. Now, right here in the middle, in between all of these dark stories of disaster and judgment, is a collection of Jeremiah's messages of hope for Israel's future. So he picks up on Moses' prediction that after Israel had broken the covenant and gone into exile, see Deuteronomy 30, God would not abandon his people. Rather, he would renew his covenant with them and transform their hearts. Jeremiah develops this promise, and he says that God is going to one day inscribe the laws of the Torah, not on tablets, but rather on the hearts of his own people. He's going to heal their rebellion so that they can truly one day love and follow him fully. And so one day, Israel will return back to the land, and the Messiah from the line of David is going to come, and that's when all nations will come to recognize Israel's God as the true God. So these chapters are showing that despite Israel's apostasy, God is not going to let Israel's sin get the final word. Rather, his own faithfulness will bring about the fulfillment of his promises no matter what. After this, we find the large collection of poems about how God is going to use Babylon to judge the nations around Israel. So Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Edom, Ammon, Damascus, Hazor. But then, surprisingly, the longest poems are saved for last, and they're about God's coming judgment on Babylon itself. So although God used this nation to execute his justice, God doesn't endorse their violence and idolatry, and so Babylon too will come under the standard of God's justice. And so Jeremiah denounces this nation's pride and injustice as well. Now, Babylon is larger than life in these poems, and it reminds us of the image of Babylon all the way back from Genesis chapter 11. Babylon has become the archetypal rebellious nation. In their glorification of wealth and war, God's going to give this nation over to its own destruction. The book concludes with a story taken from the end of the book of 2 Kings. It tells about Babylon's final attack on Jerusalem, how they destroyed the city walls and burned the temple and took the people into exile. The story shows how Jeremiah's warnings of judgment from chapters 1 through 24 were fulfilled. But then the chapter ends with a short story about the captive Israelite king Jehoiakim. He's heir to the line of David. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and shows him favor and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and that's how the book ends. So it's a little glimmer of hope. And this recalls Jeremiah's promises of hope from chapters 30 to 33. God hasn't abandoned his people or the promise of a future coming king from David's line. And so while this book contains a huge amount of warning and judgment, the final words conclude with a note of hope for the future. And that's what the book of Jeremiah is all about.
So we're going to go ahead and read through Jeremiah chapter 2 this morning. And then when we get done reading through that, we'll kind of do our usual thing of saying anything in the text that caught our eye. But if you also had something that caught your attention in the video, feel free to point that out as well. All right, so we've got chapter 2, and then we're going to end on verse 5 of chapter 3 here. So let's do 3 verses each, and go from there. So we'll start with Cody. Jeremiah chapter 2.
The word of the Lord came to me, saying, go and proclaim in the fear of Jerusalem. Thus say the Lord, I remember the devotion of your youth to the love of your palace, a bride. How you followed me in the wilderness and a lamb not sown. Just 2. 3. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruit of the harvest. All who ate of it and your guilt. Disaster came upon them because of the Lord.
Hear the word of the Lord, you descendants of Jacob, all you clans of Israel. This is what the Lord says. What fault did your ancestors find in me, that they strayed so far from me? They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. They did not ask, where is the Lord? And who brought us up out of Egypt and led us through the barren wilderness, but through a land of desert, a land of ravines, a land of drought and utter darkness, a land where no one travels and no one lives. I brought one He brought you into a fertile land to eat its fruit and its produce, but you came and defiled my land and gave my inheritance the testimony. Please do not ask, where is the Lord? What is his rule with the law? Do not refuse rebellion and see prophets prophesied by Baal, following worthless idols. Therefore I bring charges against you again, declares the Lord, and I will bring charges against your children's children.
Cross over the coast, it looked and looked. Send the tender and observe closely. See if there has ever been anything like this. Has a nation ever changed its gods? Yet they are not gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glory for the worthless idols. Be appealed at this, O heavens, and sudden with the great honor, declares the Lord. My people have committed to sins, they have forsaken me, the spirit of the living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water.
Is Israel a servant, a slave by birth? Why then is he king from birth? Yeah. Lions have roared, they have growled at him, they have laid waste his land, his towns and are burned and deserted. Also the men of Memphis and Tophens have shaved the crown of your head. Have you not brought this on yourself by forsaking the Lord your God, when he led you away?
And now they take the road to Egypt, and drink the waters of Sahara, or why take the road of Sarah, and drink the waters of the river. Your own wickedness will correct you, and your vexings will rebuke you. Know therefore and see that it is an evil and better thing that you have to seek in the Lord your God. And the fear of me is not in you, says the Lord God. So if all I have broke your yoke and burst your bonds. And he said, I will not transgress with every high hill, every green tree you lay down, planting the high rock. Yet I have planted you a noble vine, a seed of the highest quality. How then you have turned before me in the degenerate plan of the daily God.
Although you wash yourself with soap and use an abundance of cleansing powder, the stain of your guilt is still before me, declares the sovereign Lord. How can you say I am not defiled? I have not run after the Baal. See how you behaved in the valley. Consider what you have done. You are a swift she-camel running here and there, a wild donkey accustomed to the desert, sniffing the wind in her craving, in her heat who can restrain her. Any males that pursue her need not but tire themselves. At mating time they will find her. Do not run until your feet are bare and your throat is dry, but you said, it's no use. I love foreign gods, and I must go after them. As a theft and disgrace when he was caught, so the people of Israel are disgraced. They, their kings and their officials, their priests and their prophets. They say to wood, you are my father, and to stone, you gave me birth. They have turned their backs to me and not their faces. Yet when they are in trouble, they say, come and save us. Where then are the gods you made for yourselves? Let them come if they can save you when you are in trouble. For Judah has as many gods as have towns. Do you have towns?
Why do you bring charges against me? You have all rebelled against me, declares the Lord. In vain I punished your people, they did not respond to correction. Your sword has devoured your prophets, like as ravenous lion. You of this generation, consider the word of the Lord. I have been a desert to Israel, a land of great darkness. Why do my people say, we are free to live? We will come to you no more.
Can a virgin forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me, days without number. How well you direct your course to seek love, so that even to wicked women you have taught your ways. Also on your skirts is found the lifeblood of the guiltless poor. You do not find them breaking in, yet in spite of all these things, you say, I am innocent. Surely his anger has turned from me. Behold, I will bring you to judgment, for saying, I have not sinned.
Why do you go about so much children? You will be disciplined by Egypt and do not destroy it. You will also leave that place with your hands and your heart, for I have rejected fellowship and trust. You will not be left by me. If a man divorces his wife, and she lives in the land and is in the land, should he return to her again? Would not the land be completely defiled? But you have been a prostitute of many others. Will you now treat me with contempt?
Look up to the barren heights and see, is there any place where you have not been ravished by the roadside? You sat waiting for lovers, sat like a nomad in the desert. You have defiled the land with your prostitution and wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld, and the spring rains have fallen. Yet you have the rising look of a prostitute. You refuse to blush for shame. You have not just called to me, my father, my friend of my youth.
We always gave you, and you're not continuing further. This is how you talk, but you do all that you need to.
Alright, so is there anything from the video or from the text there that caught your guys' attention?
Well, I have one thing about them saying, I am you to wood you are my father.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking to myself, and I'm not sure if it's Jeremiah who says it, and it might be later, or if it's Isaiah. But one of them says to Israel, you go and cut down a tree, and half of it you make a fire and eat your dinner with it, and the other half you carve into an idol and say, you are my God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like an indignant way of saying, you're just being a little stupid here by cooking your dinner on a piece of wood that's from the same tree, and then going to the same tree and carving it and saying that it's a god.
Yeah, and I don't remember exactly where that is either, but that is exactly what the author's intent is in that section, is this process of saying, do you see how ridiculous this is? You know? And so, yeah, it's crazy just how bad that they're getting. That's what the text is trying to get at with this. So, anybody else, anything else that you saw in the video or read in the text that you thought just kind of stood out to you?
I like verse 22.
Verse 22. What about verse 22?
Although you wash yourself with soap and use an abundance of cleansing powder, the state of your guilt is still according to Moses.
Yeah. What stood out with that for you?
I don't know. Just go out.
Well, I think the one thing is, just taking from what you're saying, I'm thinking about it. In ancient times, people did not bathe. That was not something, like maybe once a week, maybe. But it wasn't that often that they took a bath. Water was very scarce, obviously, in the Middle East, they don't have much water. So it was very scarce. But he's saying, you're using all this soap that you never use to wash away all this, except it's still before me. Because water's rare, and soap usually only the kings, the highest peoples had soap. That's about it. The poorer peoples, the farmers, people like that did not have soap or water. They used water to water their plants, obviously. But
Well, one thing to remember about Jerusalem, though, is that they actually did have water I mean, water was pretty plentiful to get to the city of Jerusalem. They built a lot of special projects to bring water into the area. If you guys remember, it was either Josiah or Joash, or one of the Israelite king or Judean kings specifically went through this project to go about and like dig a whole bunch of cisterns throughout the land so they could have all the water that they wanted. So there actually is a lot of water during the reign of Jerusalem to come into the land, but the point with this particular verse is kind of the same thing that Jesus kind of talks about, is this idea of you're washing yourself to try and say that you're clean on the outside, but your sin is making you absolutely filthy. They're so concerned with trying to say that they're following the letter of the law that they're completely skipping over the intent. Okay, and so there's definitely a lot going on there, and so. And what we were talking about with Kason just a second ago as well is like, is there any particular reason that stood out to you? Remember that there might not always be a direct reason that something's standing out to you, but if something in the scripture is standing out to you, then it probably means that the Spirit's trying to say something through that passage for you. And so if you're reading through God's word and something stands out to you like that, take a moment. You might have a plan of, well, I want to read through chapters, 10 and 11 today, but if something at the very beginning of chapter 10 just really stands out to you, stop. Go back and study it and spend some time there, because God might really be trying to directly tell you something in that passage. So, before we move on, does anybody else have anything else? All right. So the main verse I wanted us to focus on this morning were verses 34 and 35. Because he says, on your clothes is found the lifeblood of the innocent poor, that you did not catch them breaking in. Yet in spite of all this, you say, I am innocent. He is not angry with me. But I will pass judgment on you because you say, I have not sinned. All right? The thing here is that God's directly calling out the people for killing innocents. Okay? And it's something that as you go through the book of Kings and such, you see this is happening way too frequently in Jerusalem. And even if they're not directly guilty of murder, they're going out to their like if Weston owes me money and he's got 3 kids, I'm taking his kids as slaves to pay for his debt. Okay, and that's completely something that God's word calls against. It specifically told people you're not to take slaves. Okay, and there were supposed to be all these rules. In fact, towards Jeremiah, we're going to get into a part where God specifically tells the people before the fall of the city occurs, hey, get rid of your slaves. Okay, but the point here is particularly that they didn't even catch them doing anything wrong. All right, so it's basically a matter of what I was just saying just a second ago. Weston has this debt to me, and I just take his kids. What's really happening is that Weston doesn't even have a debt to me. I might have just fabricated some story about how Weston owes me money, and that I need to kill his family as a result of that debt. Okay, or that I just need to take his family into slavery to pay off this debt that they owe me. All right, that's what's going on in the city. And God is saying, you guys are totally messing this up, and this has to end. And the worst part about this is that they're sitting there saying, I haven't done anything wrong. All right? And there's a difference here between saying, I have Christ who covers my sins, and because of that, my sins are washed away. There's a difference between that and saying, well, I have God, therefore I've not done anything wrong. Don't look back here. Don't focus back here. There's nothing here. I didn't do anything. What? Okay? And that's what they're trying to do. Because they're specifically saying, I didn't do anything. And that's wrong. If you ever find yourself in a position where you're sitting there saying, no, I haven't done anything. That's when you need to start checking your heart. But if you're in a spot where you're sitting there saying, I have Christ and I'm thankful for Christ because He has washed away my sins, that's a good place to be. That's a humble place to be before God. So the message this morning is that by agreeing to be God's people, we agree to His way of living. God calls on us to return when we fall away and seek His heart again. And that's exactly what Israel, or Jerusalem and Judah and Israel before them were not doing. They didn't care. They were sitting there trying to say that they were doing all this stuff and that it either didn't matter or it didn't happen. And it's just this heartbreaking thing to watch as you go through the books of the Kings and the books of the prophets. Something really quick to go through before we talk about what's going on this week. With Charlottesville, being a people of love and hope, we're called to love all those around us. Jesus specifically says in Matthew 5, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What's happened in Charlottesville this weekend is wrong on so many levels. Because, these people are specifically going through and it's all about white supremacy, KKK, and all these different things about hate. People were chanting through the streets with torches, for crying out loud, like it was the 1950s and 60s, and chanting "Jews go home" and all this nonsense, and it's ridiculous. So we definitely need to pray for Charlottesville. We need to pray for peace and healing out there, but we also need to make sure that we continue to pray for those that are really hate. Because as much as we might want to see justice done, and justice should be done, we have to remember that justice is in God's hands. And that's one thing that we're going to see as we go through the book of Jeremiah. We kind of saw a little bit when we went through Job. But we need to pray for these people because we should love them enough, even in their sin and hate and continued evil that we see. We should love them enough to still pray for them. And we need to pray for boldness as well. Because I guarantee you guys are going to see this at some point. Maybe some of you guys don't see it as much. Maybe some of you guys have seen it more than you would like to. But if you see it, we're called as people who love God and are trying to build His kingdom to call it out for what it is. It's evil, it's sickening, and it needs to stop. So, today, I saw in the bulletin that Todd's going to be here with the truck for his sister at 1 o'clock. So what we're going to do is we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to meet up at 1 o'clock at Terry's place. Her address is in the bulletin. We're going to help get the truck unloaded. And then we're going to go back to the Student Center to do our games in Devo. I think that's going to be a little bit easier as far as we got ping pong, we got basketball, we got pool, all kinds of stuff that we can do out there. Volleyball, we can set up the net.
And I've tried the pool table. I like that. We went there to get some stuff for their money and stuff.
So, yes, we need to, we'll meet up at the Student Center as soon as we get done unloading the truck. And then we're going to come back to the building at 4:30. We'll do our evening worship and our meal after that. Saturday, we're going to go to the Teenage Christian Conference. We need to leave the building at 7:30 a.m. That's early, I know. But here's the thing is we got to get lunch before we actually go in there. Registration starts at 12. We'll have to eat beforehand, and they're an hour ahead. So that kind of is a triple whammy or something. So we'll leave the building at 7:30. We'll get there, eat lunch, and they'll provide dinner, and then we'll be on our way back. So hit me up and let me know if you're able to come. And then next Sunday, we won't have an evening youth activity specifically because we've got the conference and stuff we're going to. So, all right, love you guys. I think you're awesome. Have a good week going back to school.
I am counting down.
How many weeks is it been? Okay, so.
Well, we're doing days. Like
You're already doing days.
We're 275, but that's counting weekends.
At some point you start getting
Leave me alone.
I'm not
I know.
What?